This is the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Today, my guest is George Tavlas, an alternate governor of the Bank of Greece for the European Central Bank since 2008. He's also a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he was previously the Director General of the Bank of Greece from 2010 to 2013, and a member of the General Council in the Monetary Policy Council of the Bank of Greece from 2013 to 2020. He was also an advisor to the governors when the country entered the Eurozone and was involved in the management and the resolution of the Greek debt crisis. Welcome, George.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for the invitation.
Well, I want to start by getting into your early life. Where did you grow up, and how did you first get interested in economics?
I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, to Greek immigrant parents. My father left Greece and his village in Greece and his formal education when he was 12 years old, and he came to the United States at the end of the First World War. He worked his way up and became a successful business person. He owned several retail stores and rental properties. He learned to read and write in English and read the Wall Street Journal every day. Like many immigrants, he had a simple dream. He wanted to see his children have the education that he never was able to have. And so when I was 13, he enrolled me into one of the top prep schools in New England. It is located in my hometown. It's called Worcester Academy. But then tragedy struck. Several weeks before I started my first classes, my dad died unexpectedly of a heart attack. After that, I didn't take classes. I didn't take school seriously. And so my grades at Worcester Academy were terrible. I had to repeat my junior year. And then I did something that perhaps was the first in the history of the school, which is pretty hard to do because the school was founded in the 1830s. I failed my junior year a second time around. In fact, my grades the second time around were worse than the first time. Well, that summer, after the second junior year, a letter arrived at my home addressed to my mother. It was from the headmaster of the school, and he advised her that the school board had determined that I wasn't college material. She should look elsewhere for me to enroll. My mother never saw the letter. I intercepted it and immediately went to see the headmaster, and I asked him for another chance. He gave it to me. He allowed me to enter my senior year with the provision that my grades had to show immediate improvement. Well, that changed things around. For the first time, a fire was lit under me. I realized that I had to study. My grades went up. I applied to 5 colleges, was admitted into all of them. My family steered me to Babson College. It's a business college because it had expected or assumed that I was going to go into the family business. As for the letter addressed to my mother, some years later, on the day that I received my PhD degree, I showed my mother that letter for the first time, at the same time that I showed her my PhD diploma. After I graduated from Worcester Academy, I attended Babson College, which is, as I mentioned, a business school in Massachusetts. At Babson, in my first year, I took an economic principles course with Bill Casey. Bill had just graduated from Boston College. We become lifelong friends. The course lit a fire. I knew almost from the first that I wanted to pursue economics for a career. I liked the quantification and the logic of economics. The faculty at Babson encouraged me to do my graduate work at New York University. At NYU, 3 courses were especially important for my future research. Monetary economics taught by Bill Silber. Bill and I had become lifelong friends. History of Economic Thought, and Econometrics. My dissertation combined the first two areas, monetary economics and a history of thought. Upon completing my PhD dissertation in 1977, I was offered a position as a macroeconometric modeler at a newly formed economic analysis team at the State Department. The team was created by Richard Cooper. Cooper, who had been teaching at Yale and subsequently was to teach at Harvard, had become Undersecretary of State in the Carter administration. He wanted to build
A very famous international economist who just passed away a few years ago.
Excuse me? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Yes, and he was an excellent economist and an excellent writer. Cooper wanted me, under Cooper, the main motivation for the economic analysis team under Cooper was to create a group at the State Department that could support the State Department's positions at interagency meetings. So while at State, I learned how to build and simulate macroeconometric models. While at State, I received an offer from the OECD in Paris to help them build their multi-country macro model. I accepted the offer and I took a leave of absence from the State Department in 1980. That turned out to be a good decision professionally and a great decision personally, because while living in Paris, I was able to visit Greece frequently because my mother had resettled there. And on one of those visits, I met my future wife, Sophia. After I returned to the State Department, George Shultz had become Secretary of State. Alan Wallace had become his undersecretary. Wallace had been his former colleague at Chicago. Martin Bailey, who had taught macro at Chicago in the 1960s. In 1970s, he was an assistant secretary at the U.S. Treasury, had become the chief economist. Martin was a theoretician. He was a brilliant theoretician. He needed someone to do the estimation to test his ideas, and I was the person to do it. We worked very closely together. We published several papers that continued to receive citations. I learned a lot from Martin. In 1985, I received an offer to join the IMF, and I accepted it. At the IMF, I was assigned to do research, among other things, on the international monetary system. One of the things I was especially involved with was looking at the advantages and disadvantages of a country having an international currency, such as the US dollar, a very topical issue today in light of the tariffs. However, as I rose through the ranks at the IMF and was promoted to managerial positions, I had less and less time to do research, which I especially enjoyed. And so, having spent several years visiting the Bank of Greece in the late 1990s, I accepted an offer from the bank to become a director at the bank, where I was able to continue to do research while at the same time continue to do policy relevant work in such areas as the Euro sovereign debt crisis and, of course, monetary policy. Among the responsibilities that I've had at the bank, in 2002, the then governor appointed me as his then accompanying person, but it's essentially the same as his alternate on the governing council of the ECB. Now, the way this works, each governor at the ECB is allowed to bring one person with them into the meetings to be able to consult with. The alternate takes the place of the governor should the governor not be able to attend the meetings. Since that appointment, successive governors at the Bank of Greece have reappointed me as their alternate on the governing council. So having served on the governing council as an alternate since 2002, continuously, I'm the longest serving member of the governing council. During the past 10 or 12 years, I've had the privilege to be visiting such institutions as Chicago on several occasions, Drexel, Duke, and of course, the Hoover Institution at the invitation of John Taylor. These academic associations have been instrumental in helping me revisit the fierce debates over Milton Friedman's monetarism in the 1970s when I was a graduate student. They became like a thread of my research over the years, and it's the reason that I was able to write the book, The Monetarists.
That's terrific. I want to talk about the Monetarists in a moment. I also just want to talk about a little bit about your career. I mean, you're there at the dawn of the euro. You've seen the European debt crisis in the early 2010s play out. What do you think we've learned in the past 25 years since the advent of the euro about the nature of monetary unions without a fiscal union? And what do you think uh, the euro will look like in the future? I mean, do you see there being more fiscal integration in the future? Obviously, there's a lot that's changing right now in Europe in 2025 with increased military spending and more debt being issued, for example, by Germany to partly fund this. But I'm just curious, having been there at the beginning, having seen some of its and been part of managing some of its greatest challenges, notably, Greece, the sovereign debt crisis in the early 2010s, and it's been put in a better trajectory. I mean, at the time, there were a lot of questions around whether Greece would leave the euro or other countries would leave the euro. That hasn't happened yet, but there are many critics, I guess, who say that a monetary union without a fiscal union isn't sustainable in the long run, and that encourages free riding on the part of some countries. I'm just curious what you've learned and what you think economists have learned about the nature of this monetary union.
Well, I don't think that economists have learned a great deal about the need of a fiscal union. They knew that before the euro system started. They thought that the monetary union could survive in the absence of a fiscal union because they thought that the markets would impose discipline on countries that were spending extravagantly. But it didn't happen that way. Between 2005 and 2009, Greek government debt doubled from about 100 external debt from about 150 billion to 300 billion. And yet, for much of that time, Greek interest rates were very low. The markets thought that if Greece got into trouble, the euro area would bail out Greece. It wouldn't let a crisis happen. And so while the Greek debt was building, doubling, as I mentioned, in the 5 years, 2005 to 2009, especially during the early years, 2005 and 6, Greek interest rates were not very much different from German interest rates. So one lesson that we've learned from the euro is that countries have to maintain their fiscal houses in order. We've also learned that we need to have a stronger fiscal mechanism inherently in Europe in case countries do get in trouble, where that mechanism can support the countries, may perhaps impose policies on the countries to take should a crisis erupt. Now, when the crisis erupted in Greece in late 2009, the the euro system had to rely on the IMF and the European Union, and it was a little bit unorthodox because having been at the IMF, when a country got into trouble and the IMF visited the country to see what policies would be needed, the IMF would sit on one side of the table, and the finance ministry and the central banks from the other country would sit on the other side. When the Greek crisis erupted, we had the Bank of Greece and the finance ministry on one side, On the other side, we had the IMF, we had the European Commission, and we had the central bank of the euro area, the ECB. So in a way, there was there was a clash between our central bank, which was really the ECB, and the policies that were being formulated to deal with the Greek crisis. In retrospect, the crises that were taken in Greece were very, very contractionary. And it was very difficult for Greece to emerge from the crisis. We needed support uh, from the rest of the union, but we didn't get the support. And so what happened? Uh, the markets, of course, perceive this, and they perceive that there's some other countries on the line that could possibly erupt into crises, such as Portugal, uh, Ireland, and even Spain, which required a program for its banking system. So one lesson that we learned is that we need to have an internal mechanism within the euro area, so we don't need to rely on the IMF should a crisis erupt. Another thing that we learned was, and now, as I mentioned, at the beginning of the euro area, people understood that we weren't a complete fiscal union, and that was going to create a problem. But one thing we didn't anticipate, nobody essentially anticipated, maybe one or two people in peripheral journals, because I came across one person who argued this in the early 1990s, but nobody paid attention to him. We learned that we needed a banking union. We learned that if Greek banks got in trouble, the markets weren't going to believe that the Greek government, a small country, is going to be able to take care of the banks. Now, we had a situation in the US, I think it was in 2002, as Silicon Valley Bank got in trouble. You remember that?
Mhm.
And one or two other banks followed suit, and those banks were going under. And it started looking like it could become a full-scale crisis. And so the stock market, the financial markets began to tank. And then one day, within days of the crisis having erupted, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen said, all depositors will be covered in full. The next day, or around the same time, Jerome Powell said the same thing. Was it Jerome Powell who was, yeah, Jerome Powell said the same thing. We will bail out everybody. End of crisis. We don't have that in the Eurozone. If the Greek government said in 2012-13, we'll take care of the Greek banks, crisis over, where were they going to get the resources? They didn't have it. So we also need a banking union. We also need a capital markets union to further integrate countries, across countries. So there are certain priorities or prerequisites for a well-functioning monetary union that we started to build. We're in the process of building, but we're not all the way there yet. We've learned lessons, we're applying it, but it's a slow lesson to come to a complete monetary union. And that's one reason why, despite the fact that the dollar has been under siege as an international currency over the last year, there's really no rival to come up and take the dollar's place. It's Chinese yuan, the financial markets are very opaque. Investors don't want to go with the Chinese yuan. The euro area, we have tried to make the euro an international currency, but we still lack the mechanisms I just underlined to make the euro such a valid international currency. We're some way away from doing that. We're working on it. It's moving in that direction, but things are slow. My governor, by the way, had a a guest column in the Economist about 2 months ago, Yanis Donatas, which was pointed out all those issues in a very nice way.
Perfect. So I want to get into your book, The Monetarists, which you published in 2023 with the University of Chicago Press. And this book essentially argues that on the topic of monetarism, which I think is, broadly speaking, the doctrine that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and that MV equals PQ. It's the quantity, the theory of exchange, or the quantity theory of money. That's sort of front and center for monetary policy. That monetary policy aggregates matter. Some monetarists might argue, were certainly arguing in the 1980s, that monetary aggregates were a monetary policy tool that should be used. I think economists have shifted a bit away from that, obviously embracing interest rates. But this was an idea that was largely promoted by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in, I think, the public mind. There was a big book that they released, a monetary history of the United States, very famous book that tries to make the case that the contraction of the money supply caused the Great Depression. And then this was published in the 1960s, and a very popular book, and arguably one of Friedman's most influential books. Now, your book, The Monetarists, sort of gets into this, the intellectual history of monetarism, and argues that there was a tradition of monetarism before Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, largely at the University of Chicago. And I'm just curious, how did you get into the debates about Chicago monetarism, and could you explain to us who some of these earlier Chicago monetarists were, and how they might have influenced Friedman later?
Well, how did I get into the debate?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how did getting into this intellectual history begin for you, and how did you sort of discover that the story of Chicago monetarism begins well before Milton Friedman?
Well, when I was doing my dissertation in the middle of 1970s, there was a heated controversy underway between Milton Friedman on one side and just about everybody else on the other side. Friedman had claimed that his monetarist views were well, Friedman, let me backtrack. He had been a graduate student and a research assistant at the University of Chicago in the first half of the 1930s. And when monetarism began traction in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he had argued that his monetarist views derived from an important, what he called, oral quantity theory tradition at Chicago. That tradition, he argued, differed from other versions, what he called rigid versions of the quantity theory utilized at other institutions, because unlike those other versions, he argued that the Chicago version was policy relevant. And this policy relevance, he argued, was able to leave the Chicago quantity theorists less vulnerable to the Keynesian revolution than quantity theorists at other institutions. He singled out some of his mentors as having developed the Chicago quantity theory. I'll mention four of them: Henry Simons, Lloyd Mintz, Frank Knight, and Jacob Viner. Now, with the rise of monetarism as a counter-revolutionary force in the late 1960s, Friedman's claim of a Chicago monetary tradition came under fire. The first to take aim at Friedman was Don Patinkin, who had undertaken his graduate studies and undergraduate studies at Chicago in the 1930s and 1940s. In 1969, writing in the inaugural issue of the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking, Patinkin presented evidence, doctrinal evidence from the writings and teachings of his teachers at Chicago, showing that Friedman's theoretical framework had nothing to do with what had been written about or taught at Chicago in the 1920s and 1930s. because Patikin showed that the earlier Chicagoans used Irving Fisher's, as you mentioned, velocity-based equation of exchange, money times velocity equals prices times transactions. Whereas Friedman used a money demand approach to his monetary analysis. And so the issue arises that since the two theories were so different, how could they be related? Well, enter into the picture Harry Johnson, who was Friedman's Chicago colleague, not
Famous
necessarily,
international economist.
not, huh?
A very famous
Yeah,
international economist, let's
his
say, also
Chicago colleague, not
Canadian.
necessarily his Chicago friend,
Mhm.
who used the occasion of the 1970 Richard T. Ely lecture in front of the American Economic Association to argue that, well, he made the argument that if in order to create a successful counter-revolution to the Keynesian revolution, Friedman had to establish some plausible linkage with pre-Keynesian orthodoxy, with what came before the Keynesian revolution. Friedman's solution, in Johnson's words, was to, and this is pretty brutal, to invent a Chicago monetary tradition. In Johnson's words, Friedman had engaged in scholarly chicanery. In the debate with Patikin on this issue in the Journal of Political Economy in 1972, Friedman admitted that his monetary theory had been influenced by Keynesian theory, but he also continued to insist that his overall monetary economics was what he continued to argue was a direct outgrowth of a unique Chicago quantity theory tradition. He was incensed with both Patinkin and Johnson. He thought that Patinkin had mischaracterized the Chicago monetary tradition and by doing so had damaged his, Friedman's, professional reputation. In private correspondence, he accused Johnson of having committed libel. And so, while I was a graduate student, I had followed the debate closely. And I decided to write my dissertation on the origins, the doctrinal historical origins of monetarism. I wrote 5 essays. 4 had been accepted in journals. The 5th one dealt directly with the Friedman-Patinkin exchange in the Journal of Political Economy. I wrote a paper in which I showed that there were Chicago economists in the late 20s, early 30s who were in favor of policy rules like Friedman. And not only that, they advocated a Friedman rule before Friedman did. They advocated that the money supply should grow by 3 to 5% annually.
Mm.
I submitted that paper to the Journal of Political Economy. The editor wrote back that he sent the paper, in his words, to a learned scholar in the area. The learned scholar wrote a lengthy rejection letter. Now, at that time in the 1970s, one of the most popular graduate textbooks was Patinkin's 1965 Money, Interest, and Prices. I had studied it, read it many times and studied it very hard. And I knew Patinkin's writing style. I had no doubt that Patinkin was the guy who rejected my paper. So I then submitted the paper to the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. The editor wrote back that he sent the paper to an associate editor. The associate editor liked the paper, but he thought that the only 2 people that were really qualified to judge it were Don Patinkin and Milton Friedman. The editor wrote to me that he asked Patinkin and Friedman to referee the paper. Patinkin wrote back that he already refereed and rejected the paper, confirming my suspicion. Friedman had not responded. The editor said, I leave it up to you to see if you can get Friedman to respond to your paper. I wrote to Friedman and told him what the circumstances were. He wrote a lengthy letter to the editor of the JMCB telling him that the paper should be accepted. It was published in 1977. And there began a lengthy correspondence between me and Friedman that lasted until a couple of months before Friedman passed away. That's how I got involved in the debate about the Chicago monetary tradition.
That's fascinating. All these characters were involved in, and famously, a lot of these, iconoclast economists would clash with each other. And I guess it's, one thing that I guess some don't realize is that, I guess the Chicago school isn't necessarily like a monolithic um, school of economists, and also, it's very fascinating that you're pointing out this fact that the idea for like a K% money growth rule sort of preceded Friedman. I think the equation of exchange, MV equals PQ goes back to I think David Hume, maybe even earlier. So I think at some level there's sort of different schools of monetarism in the sense that like today there's maybe some people who argue that I think increasingly following the early 2020s inflation that which also saw the money supply or measures the money supply like M2 grow pretty rapidly during that same time, that we should look back to monetary aggregates, which previously had fallen out of favor. I guess my question,
Can I just let me say one thing, John? Monetarism is just not money. Money was the vehicle that Friedman thought was important for judging monetary policy. But the lasting contribution of monetarism was to bring back or highlight the importance of monetary policy itself. In the
Mhm.
1940s, 50s, 60s, even the first half of the 70s, monetary policy was considered a secondary tool. It took a backseat to fiscal policy. What Friedman and monetarism didn't bring back money. That was their way of saying that that monetary policy was important. But what really mattered was monetary policy, whether with money or with interest rates, that monetary policy was one of the most important tools in the macroeconomy. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, it was downgraded. It had secondary status. So the monetarist revolution, when some people say, well, where's money? Doesn't matter. What matters is look where monetary policy is. It's right there on top. It's the primary tool for managing the macroeconomy. When the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank make a decision on interest rates, everybody's following. Everybody reacts. And depending upon the decisions, the reactions could be benign or they can be very volatile. But monetary policy is right there at the top of the policy list, of the policy options that we have in the economy. And that is
Absolutely.
due to monetarism.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that thinking back to the 1970s, I think there was an idea that inflation. Some people argued that price controls were the right answer to fight inflation. This was I think apparent in the Nixon administration, and
That was
and
Arthur Burns. That was Arthur Burns, who, when he was appointed chair of the Federal Reserve, Friedman was ecstatic because he thought that Burns was somebody who understood monetary policy. But no, Burns relied, as you said, on price and wage controls. He let monetary policy run loose, and we had two episodes, one in the mid 1970s and one in the mid 1970s, where inflation reached double-digit levels, and it was Paul Volcker who came on the scene, and he understood more as well as anybody else the importance of endogenous expectations. He understood that markets had to have belief in that the Federal Reserve is doing the right thing. Volcker's approach was to apply cold turkey, raise interest rates to close to 20% let the economy go into recession. It had to prove something. It had to prove that the Federal Reserve was what we now call hard-nosed. It had to gain
Hmm.
credibility. The Fed gained credibility under Volcker, and it maintained credibility under the successive Fed chairs like Alan Greenspan and Bernanke and Yellen. They all understood that credibility is very, very important. And when we had the rise of inflation in the early 2020s, both the ECB and the Fed may have been a little slow to react, especially the Fed, but the Fed had credibility. Price expectations never took off because the markets had believed that the Fed would take the necessary action to bring inflation back down, and it did. And that's all the legacy of what happened in the late 1970s, early 80s from Volcker.
I also tend to think that there's two schools of monetarism. And I think there's various sub-schools of monetarism in the sense that there's, I'd say, a group of maybe passive monetarists, think Milton Friedman K% rule, that argues, that the Fed should just be run like a computer, just grow the money supply by 2% every year. We don't need FOMC meetings, or we don't need monetary policy council or committee meetings, and that the central bank's sole job should be just to maintain price stability, and do so with a constant money percent growth rule, and that's it. And I would say there's maybe another school of people who argue that yes, MV equals PQ matters, but per Friedman's observation, monetary policy is not neutral in the short run, and that it can impact real economic variables, and that the Fed or central banks should intervene during periods of recession, should provide monetary accommodation to improve real economic variables during recessionary times, and should also contract the money supply when the economy is so-called overheating, and you get big spurts of inflation. I'm curious how you've seen that play out, I guess, um, in your research of the monetarists, of how people think, how different monetarists have thought that money should be used in monetary policy.
Well, I think Friedman wouldn't always say that a monetary role should be used all the time. When we were in the Great Depression, he would not have advocated a monetary role. He thought that this was the time to employ activist monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy. What he does argue, however, is that by following a rule, we're less likely to have episodes as we did during the Great Depression, that the central banks sometimes do make mistakes. Sometimes they are under political pressures. We see that today, don't we? That they make policy mistakes because of the political pressures and for other reasons. And in order to keep the economy on a more even keel, you follow a policy rule. I think the same thing applies to a Taylor rule. The Taylor rule is an activist rule because it involves the economy responding to developments in the economy, whereas Friedman's rule does not. Friedman's rule is always 3 to 5% monetary growth. But the advantage of a monetary rule is that it prevents policy mistakes from occurring, and it prevents political interference with monetary policy. The debate continues. It's hard to take a position on one side or the other, especially since I'm a central banker, and I don't want to, I don't want to prejudge this issue as a central banker.
I want to ask you about the current state of monetarism, and how how it kind of fell out of favor, in the
Oh,
sense
well,
that how monetarism in part has fallen out of favor at central banks and in monetary economics and in academia. So, how I think of, I guess, the sort of rough history of these things is you had the sort of old Keynesians, and then around the same time in the 1970s, you sort of had both in the 60s and 70s, you had both monetarists emerging, like Milton Friedman, and those that were highlighting MV equals PQ, which is, I think, very popular in the public, in the public in general. MV equals PQ is, I think, a pretty easy thing to communicate. And then, for a brief period of time, the Federal Reserve was targeting monetary policy aggregates in the 1980s. And then it sort of realized that money demand wasn't quite predictable, and it kind of abandoned that. And then it moved toward targeting interest rates. So, sort of in parallel, what was going on at the same time, in the 70s, you had the rise of the rational expectations revolution that influenced macroeconomists, thinking, Prescott, Sargent, and many others who were very influential. And the challenge there, though, was that policy, monetary policy didn't really matter. So you also had folks, the new Keynesians kind of emerged around that time as well. Folks like John Taylor, Guillermo Calvo, and later Mike Woodford, and Rich Clark and many others, Jordy Galley, who argued that, well, if you have some sort of frictions, whether it's seeking prices or seeking wages or seeking information, that you could monetary policy could produce real economic effects. You would get monetary non-neutrality, and not only that, but you also have interest rates as being sort of the key monetary policy instrument in that type of modeling. And so in the early 90s, there was, I think, this pretty quick shift along with when inflation targeting was introduced, to sort of put interest rates as sort of the key policy instrument of interest, no longer money, no longer thinking about the money supply. And then then central bankers got very focused on targeting inflation, 2% in particular, largely 2% inflation targets, and use interest rates to achieve that, and not necessarily target some sort of monetary aggregate growth. And I think we've kind of been in that regime for the past, say, 35 years or so, where economists who are writing macroeconomic models write down these 3-equation DSGE models, Keynesian DSGE models, and essentially, there's a Taylor rule in there, a monetary policy rule. There's a Phillips curve. There's an IS equation, or think it was like an aggregate demand, kind of like a equation investment savings curve, and that's it. Money is nowhere to be found. So I'm just curious that there's some people who point to monetary aggregates as being sort of a useful indicator, maybe a predictor of inflation. And many people on Wall Street, I think, still use money and talk about monetarism all the time. But largely, when I hear about monetarism today, it's not in academic seminars or from central banks. It's largely from Wall Street or a few monetary economists and a few monetarists who are still out there. I'm curious, what happened in your mind, and is money
well,
making a comeback in any way?
I think you got it pretty right when you made the analysis about monetary aggregates were unstable in the 1980s and 1990s, and so central banks stop putting an emphasis on growth of monetary aggregates. When the ECB started in 1999, its main pillar for monetary policy was M3 growth, but that lasted for about 4 or 5 or 6 years, and it became evident that focusing on monetary growth or monetary policy was not the right way to go, that the aggregates were unstable and could not be relied on. And so just like the other central banks, the ECB, started focusing on interest rates. I think this is just taking into account reality. Now, in the year 2020, when just before inflation started taking off, M3 in the US jumped by, I think it was 35% in 1 year. We had a very, very large, perhaps not as large rise in M2 in the Eurozone. And sure enough, a year or two later, we had big surges of inflation. Now, you can argue whether those surges were due to the monetary growth itself, to the financing of fiscal deficits, especially in the US, or to the supply side shocks that came from COVID and the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. But in any case, it provided a bit of a rebound for the view that money, as under monetarism, matters, but it was not a long-lasting, it did make a long-lasting impression on monetary policy makers. But what is important is what I referred to earlier, is that, all right, we get inflation up as we did in 22, 23. How do we bring it down? We, we bring it down by wage price controls. Nobody ever talks about wage price controls anymore. We know they're a failure. From the 1970s, we brought them down by high interest rates, monetary policy. If you didn't know the debates in the 1950s and 1960s, you would have never had suspected that monetary policy would become the chief instrument for dealing with shocks on the inflation front. So again, a lasting contribution from Milton Friedman was the emphasis that he put, and other monetarists, that they put on monetary policy per se, whether pursued by having the main instrument the money supply, or the main instrument the interest rate. And don't forget, when we had quantitative easing in the Eurozone in 2014, 2015, that was essentially increasing the money supply to try and get the interest rate up, because we reached the lower bound of interest rates. We even had negative interest rates in the Eurozone, but they weren't being effective in bringing inflation up. So we relied on quantitative easing, which meant buying large purchases of bonds and increasing the money supply. So I would not go so far to say that monetarism as a emphasis on money is something that is no longer being discussed. It has been used. It has shown to be valid in the years 2020 and 21 in terms of bringing inflation up. And monetary policy itself has been the main tool for bringing inflation under control.
Well, it's
And one other thing, if I may, one of the tenets of monetarism, I would call it a tenet of Friedman's monetarism, was the importance of flexible exchange rates. When Friedman first wrote his article on the desirability of flexible exchange rates in 1953, he predicted the demise of the Bretton Woods adjustable peg system. He said it couldn't last. He said we would move to a system of flexible exchange rates. Sooner or later, we would get there. It was the only system that would be viable and sustainable. He was right. In 1973, the world moved to a system of flexible exchange rates. That became part of monetarism. And so, when we say monetarism, it's just not money. It's other things as well. It's rules versus discretion. It doesn't have to be a 3 to 5% monetary rule. We now think that a Taylor rule works better, but it's rules versus discretion. So there are a number of aspects to monetarism that have survived to this day, even though the emphasis on the quantity of money is not the main element that has survived.
Absolutely. It's interesting too, you think about, and we're talking about largely advanced economies and economies where I think inflation's been fairly stable. I think, even setting aside the early 2020s, inflation jumping to nearly 10%,
Over 10% in Europe.
over 10% in Europe, but in the US, just under 10%. But, I think about, all these episodes of hyperinflation and, thinking to Zimbabwe, thinking to Venezuela, and thinking to all these episodes where there's been massive amounts of inflation. You can see there's obviously in all these cases there's a massive surge in the money supply, and there's Tom Sargent's very famous paper, The Ends of Four Big Hyperinflations, I think is the title of it, the Ends of Four Big Inflations. And that in particular looks at all the interwar European countries, Germany, Weimar Germany, Austria, Hungary, that had these massive inflations. They were trying to essentially inflate away their war-related debts. And it's interesting how just in all these cases, money is there and it's expanding enormously. And so, all these regressions that I like to show of monetary policy growth versus inflation. When you plot all this cross-country data, you see a pretty clear relationship that when you have massive inflations, there's always a money story there. Now, when we get into low inflation environments, like in advanced economies, it's less clear that there's such a direct relationship between money and prices at lower levels of inflation. But with big hyperinflations, money is always growing enormously. So I think Friedman's maxim that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon bears a lot of truth. I think especially with larger inflations, especially with looking at the cross-country and historical evidence. So I think there's a very good. I think monetarism itself, for this idea that money is behind inflation, certainly I think holds up well, especially when we look at larger inflations. George, I want
It
to.
also holds up at 5 to 10% inflation rates too.
Mm-hmm.
There have been studies done that show that money is a predominant cause of inflations in the levels between, as I mentioned, 5 and 10%. It's only at low frequencies of inflation, 1, 2, 3%, that money is not an important variable these days. But at the medium frequencies and the very high frequencies that you mentioned, it's always a predominant cause of inflation.
Absolutely.
So one reason why perhaps less emphasis is placed on money over the past 25, 30 years is because we've had low inflation rates. But as we know, we had a high inflation rate in 22, 23. And we also know that that was preceded by very high rates of money growth, both in the US and the Eurozone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, George. I really want to thank you for coming on and for all your excellent scholarly work on monetarism and monetary economics, as well as all your public service. It's a real honor to have you on.
It's been a pleasure and an honor, and I thank you so much for having invited me.
This is the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century Podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Thanks so much for joining us.